Hi, everyone. Welcome to our last lecture on our full week, our first full week together in term four. As always, if you need anything from me, please let me know, email, remind, whatever it is. Please just keep me in the loop if you need something. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. I will forewarn you up front. This should be a quicker lecture because there are some things that I'd like you to kind of do some digging at or do some looking at. But let's go ahead and get into it. All right. So in the Cold War, we're now under Eisenhower. So Eisenhower is going to take over from Truman. And kind of an interesting thing, Truman decides not to run for reelection because he thinks that Eisenhower is going to win. So just a reminder, Truman is a Democrat. Eisenhower, even though he was a famous World War II general, he was not really into politics. People didn't know a lot about his politics, just so they trusted his leadership. So Truman's going to decide not to run for re-election because he thinks that Eisenhower is going to run as a Democrat, and he doesn't. He runs and wins as a Republican, and his vice president is going to be this guy Nixon right here, which I've mentioned him a couple times. He is the man that will ultimately run for president of the United States and win in the end of the 1960s. Okay, so this is who we got. Under Truman, we had this idea of containment. But under Eisenhower, there's going to be a stronger emphasis on trying to roll back communism and the Soviet Union. So not just to contain it, but to try and get it to recede. And the man that is helping Eisenhower with that is John Foster Dulles, who is the Secretary of State under Eisenhower. And he has two ideas that go under that, or under his job in the Secretary of State. So massive retaliation. The U.S. will use massive retaliation, or you might say revenge, with the Soviet Union to settle some sort of a conflict. It's really the threat of massive retaliation to kind of keep the Soviet Union in check, because when we talk about massive retaliation at this moment, we're talking about nuclear weapons. The other idea is brinkmanship, and you can see this word brink in there. And so this is the diplomatic policy of going to, I should say, brink of war. Essentially, that this threat is so strong that it will bring results without having to follow through. So we can get it to the brink of war, and the threat of being that close to war will kind of get things to settle down. So in both of these, it's this threat of some sort of a massive thing that will bring people to the negotiating table. All right. We also see the creation of the CIA. Technically, this happens under Truman, but we're going to see it change the way that it's used in the Eisenhower era. And just in case you're unfamiliar, the CIA stands for the Central Intelligence Agency, and it is the part of the American government that is spying and collecting data on the international community. So this is also interesting to think about. Remember that this is a time that Americans are very afraid of Soviet spies or people spying on Americans. But it's something that all countries do. It's this major part of the CIA. And we will talk about some more negative or nefarious things that the CIA will do at the same time. The other thing I'll just point out is the domestic version of the CIA. So the agency that is supposed to be investigating national or domestic things is the FBI. And again, that's Hoover that's in charge of that. All right. So at this time, Stalin's going to die. It's a very interesting story about how he dies. So if that's your jam, go look into that. And Khrushchev is going to take over in the Soviet Union. And some of the things, or one of the things that Eisenhower tries with this new leadership is something called the Open Skies Treaty, or Open Skies idea. And Eisenhower comes up with this idea. You know what? What will make us all feel safe or are more comfortable is if we have the ability to spy over each other's country, over our military operations, and just so we know what's going on. And Khrushchev says, no, I don't think so. So this would be the equivalent of like your neighbor wants to like snoop in your backyard or fly a drone over your backyard and be like, no, get out of my stuff, my business. And Eisenhower says, oh, okay, and then does it anyway. And we actually have a American pilot that is shot down in Soviet airspace and is captured. And so there's essentially going to be a trade for our pilot and a Soviet a spy that's caught in the United States. So if you're interested in kind of what happens with that, that's what Bridge of Spies is about, which is this film over here with Tom Hanks. And it's pretty good, so it might be something you want to check out. It's probably on some streaming service out there. Okay? The other thing is we're going to start to see things heat up in Vietnam under Eisenhower. We will come back to that when we talk about the Vietnam War. The one thing I'll just point out right now is much like Korea was divided in half after World War II, the same thing happens to Vietnam, and they are supposed to vote to reunify. And the people of Vietnam are supposed to vote for what kind of leadership do they want to be under. A US-backed government or a communist Soviet-backed, or what we think is a communist Soviet-backed government. And because they might vote to go with a communist leadership, Eisenhower does not support free elections. And I've already said this quite a few times, but it's pretty important that lots of times what America decides to do, it's not about actually protecting democracy. It's about furthering U.S. or furthering governments that the U.S. thinks that they can work with, or will be puppets for the American government, or good spots to sell American goods. And they're very worried about a communist winning, even if it's in a democratically elected situation through an election. All right, we're going to pause just for a second and move myself a little bit. One of the things that I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of is that there is lots of domestic change that is happening at the same time that we are doing things abroad in this time period. So the very beginning of the civil rights movement is going on under Eisenhower. We're going to see two major changes. One, and this is the civil rights movement, is the Brown v. Board of Education decision. You guys might have heard of this before. This is what will lead to school desegregation. We'll say that separate is not equal and we need to integrate schools. However, schools are not very excited about that. And again, we'll get to this in much more detail in the next unit. So the states are not going to be very helpful in getting that to happen. So there are going to be some African Americans, very brave African American students who are going to challenge this. And so this is a picture of one of the Little Rock Nine who's challenging this and trying to integrate a school in Arkansas. Because you can see there's a lot of threat of violence or violence towards these students, Eisenhower is going to have to send in the National Guard to protect these students. And we're also going to see the bus boycotts in Montgomery. So you see two major things from the civil rights movement that's going on. That will require the federal government to make some decisions about whether they're going to support these movements or not. The reason that this is really important, though, for the Cold War is earlier I talked about human rights, and that at this time we get the UN's list of human rights, so those 30 human rights. And I mentioned that you can divide them between civil and political, and social and economic. The amount of racism that exists in the United States, or the inequality, whether it's about race or economics, which are often tied together, is going to give the Soviet Union some things that they can hit the United States about. They're like, look what you don't allow in your country. And it really shows some weaknesses in the United States leadership and who we are as a nation, that we supposedly are these heroes and these champions of civil rights and spreading freedom and democracy around the world, but we clearly have some major problems in the United States. And so it's something that not only the U.S. leadership is often worried about because they look hypocritical, but also something that the Soviet Union is going to constantly kind of harbor the United States about. Okay? All right, the other thing is, please don't forget that this is the McCarthyism era, and Eisenhower comes to power or becomes president when McCarthy is still doing his thing. Even though they're both Republicans, even Eisenhower is unwilling to publicly go out against McCarthy. And that is, again, for the same reason that I mentioned before, because anybody who criticizes McCarthy is then going to be on his list of people to attack and to make accusations against. And so you see that people we would hope would maybe step up to the plate and serve as true leaders against sort of the vile nature of the McCarthys of the world Sometimes they don't do that, and that fear or worry about what happens, you definitely see that play out. All right. Some of the other things that we are going to see under Eisenhower is really the growth of what's known as atomic anxiety. And you might think back to the John Green video or what I mentioned about the John Green video if you didn't watch it. But for many people, the question of this era is, when will I blow up? So really afraid of nuclear weapons and the potential of a nuclear war. And this is going to grow, particularly under Eisenhower and moving forward, because of what's known as an arms race. So there's competition to get bigger and badder weapons, bigger and badder nuclear weapons. Not only the United States and the Soviet Union, but also places like France and Great Britain and others. So because we are focused more on nuclear power, we're going to see an increase in the size of the Air Force because you need planes that are big enough to drop those weapons and to be flexible enough to be able to deliver those wherever the United States maybe decided that they were going to attack somebody. So focus on that and missiles, how you would deliver them. And you're going to reduce your focus on conventional methods. So the Army or other parts of the military. So maybe less tanks, a smaller standing army, and things like that. And that's really the influence of John Foster Dulles that's going to lead to that change. The other thing is we're going to see an increase in research money and education spending. So a lot of money into what's known as R&D, so research and development into weapons and military technology. This is actually going to be one of the reasons that the Silicon Valley and the education system, the UC system, college system in California is going to drastically grow. You see the roots of that in World War II, where you see a lot of the development or the research for nuclear weapons comes out of places like Stanford or Berkeley. And then in the aftermath, they're going to be the hub of kind of that creation stuff. Which is always interesting because Silicon Valley is very much like we pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps. We did this in our garage. We did this all by ourselves. Really, there's a lot of government money and a lot of government spending that allows for that. Even Steve Wozniak, or whatever his last name is, that is connected to Apple, his dad was a military contractor or worked for a company that was doing research for the military. And so you see the connection to the government and its influence on things that we think are totally separated. The other thing we're going to see is a lot of money on, or a lot of spending on education. And this is not history, so we don't, repeat our mistakes from the past, but things like science and math. Again, so that we can use that to defeat the enemy of the Soviet Union. Some focus also on nuclear power. So how do you harness nuclear power to use that as a power source rather than just for destruction? One of the reasons that you really are going to see not only anxiety grow, but also increased spending is Sputnik, which is going to be a Soviet satellite. The Soviets beat us getting a satellite into outer space. So even though we're winning on almost every other metric, they're going to do that first. And to Americans, that seems like we're losing, even though those in charge, those in the government, know that technologically we're fine. To the American people, it's going to look like we're losing our edge. And you're going to see a lot of spending increases and things like that, so that we make sure that we don't lose in the future. And so this is where we're going to see the creation of NASA. All right. So if the question of the day is, when will I blow up? And we're thinking that the government's responsibility is to keep people safe or prevent them from blowing up. The government has to figure out how do they do that? Or how do they at least sell to the American people that we are safe and ready? But what they know is that if there really was a nuclear attack, the government might not actually be around to help the people. So how do you kind of help prep the people to take care of themselves? So you see a couple things. You see the creation of the FCDA, so the Federal Civil Defense Administration. And that does things like help people figure out how you would build a bomb shelter, what kind of food should you have in your house, and all these sort of things. There's a lot of reliance on women to kind of help families prepare in that situation. and you might think about how things work in your own home, and maybe it's mom or somebody or grandma or somebody in your house that is making sure that you are prepared, that you're prepared for anything that kind of life throws at you. So it's kind of that anticipation at this moment. And you do see that some people will build bomb shelters like in their backyard. So you see that because people are afraid. And I always think this is funny. My mom and her family thought that they had done that, but they just picked a closet in their house. That was going to be their bomb shelter, which I always find funny because how's that closet or that room any different than anywhere else in the house? It wasn't going to protect them from a nuclear attack. Not that a lot of these things would help you, but it made people feel better at that moment. And so, speaking of making people feel better, one of the things that the government does with the SCDA is to make this film to help children prepare for a nuclear attack, how to keep yourself safe. So I'm going to go ahead and show you the first kind of minute of this propaganda film or this PSA, this public service announcement. And I want you to think about whether this would really keep children safe and maybe where you see this in your own school or education system.
Dum dum, beetle dum dum, beetle dum dum, beetle dum dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and covered. He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover. This is an official.
All right, so we got our little Bert the Turtle that's going to help us. And it's really funny. This seems kind of ridiculous. It's also a silly kids film, but it was the idea that like duck and cover, like get under your desk, and that will keep you safe. We can probably guess the power of nuclear weapons, and hiding under your desk is not going to keep you safe in that moment in time. But it makes people feel better to have a plan, to think that there's something you do in an emergency. We might be able to compare that to some of the silly things that we do that are supposed to keep us safe, whether it's in a fire drill or an active shooter drill or things like that. And they are meant to make us feel better, even if it might not be so helpful in the actual event. All right. So last couple things on here. Operation Alert is they essentially do a test in Washington, D.C. About what would happen if there was a nuclear thing, like how essentially play out what would happen. The interesting thing is those in Congress don't actually follow it. They just keep going. So not a lot of confidence in our ability if there was a nuclear attack. And the last thing is just the role of media and art. Journalists as well as artists are very much on board about talking about essentially in this situation, like making sure people are aware of these things or talking about these things. I might argue that they're also kind of fueling the fear, but very much those things are showing up in American society and things that people are talking about or reading about or seeing. All right, just a couple of things. If this is your jam, the Lawrence Livermore Lab, which is responsible for a lot of these testing, they have digitized a lot of their nuclear explosions. So if that's your thing, you can watch some of them here. And this is just a simulator, and you can blow places up with different kind of nuclear weapons. If that's your thing, there you go. All right, just a couple of other things if you're interested. This is a little clip about a couple months ago. Actually, now it's like a year ago. There was a false missile threat in Hawaii. So everybody in Hawaii got a text message that said essentially a nuclear weapon was coming. So it's kind of about that experience if you were interested. This is about fallout shelters, and so something you might be interested in. And also, all of the stuff about North Korea and the United States in the last few years, I might challenge you to look into some of that. Not only the weird relationship between the US president and the North Korean dictator, but also just about North Korea's nuclear capability. All right. I also might challenge you to think about where we see the connection between pop culture and foreign policy or government. Sometimes our pop culture or things of that nature mirrors what's happening in our foreign policy stuff. And sometimes it works the other way. So we talked about the interview in, I think, our last video. So thinking about the interplay between those things. Some other things you might think about is at this time in the Cold War, a lot of the movies are about the Cold War. So I mentioned James Bond. Today we might think about one of our major concerns or foreign policy things is a war on terror or our involvement in the Middle East. And so you see that in a lot of films. A lot of action films or things like that will have similar themes to what the United States is dealing with. You might think about today, are we going to see any pandemic movies that come out? I know that there was a surge on like Netflix of people watching a couple different pandemic movies that have come out in the last few years. We've also seen kind of a rise in dystopian films or and more people watching dystopian films in the last couple of years, feeling like that kind of matches what's happening in the world right now or in the United States. So you kind of see the interplay between art and reality. All right. So one of the other things that we see under Eisenhower, or really he talks about as he's leaving office, which is kind of strange, but this idea of a military-industrial complex. And what he says, and he says this kind of in his goodbye speech, is that prior to World War II, we didn't have a permanent defense industry. What we did, we would just ramp up defense production or war production when we needed it. So during a war, we would get private industries to make that switch. But post-World War II, we see a massive defense industry. So people that are making, or companies that are making things to help make sure that we can fight any sort of war, a massive war. Eisenhower is going to claim that this is a threat to freedom. Essentially, that you're giving these private companies a lot of power by having them make all of these items. And the really important part of that is that these companies, so let's say they make the aircraft that's going to carry the bomb or something like that. They have an economic incentive to keep us on the brink of war, to keep the United States on the brink of war, because that's how they make money. And so what Eisenhower is really saying is we need to be really careful about those who want us to get close to war or those who are arguing for war. Are they doing it because it's in America's best interest, or are they doing it because it's in their own personal best interest? And we see that today in lots of ways, but when it comes to the military, we see that in the use of military contractors, as well as lots of private companies that have contracts with the American government to produce things or even to serve overseas. In the last couple of decades, we've actually seen lots of military contractors, so private individuals who have fought or served overseas rather than our actual military. That's been pretty dang complicated. I might also challenge you to think about, do you see that in this pandemic at all? Are there people that are profiting off of this pandemic? Is it because they bought up all the hand sanitizer and they're trying to price gouge or charge you for too much? Did they do the same thing with masks? Did the price of things rapidly change after the pandemic started? There's been some talk about some Congress members who knew the pandemic was coming or knew the potential of the pandemic and then bought or sold stock and with that information and made money or prevented the loss of money. And so we need to ask ourselves some questions. Should that be happening? Should people be profiting or using their economic incentive to alter what we do in the United States or to put pressure on leadership within the United States? It's also really weird that Eisenhower is criticizing the government for this or telling Americans to be careful of this is because he'd just been president for quite a while, and he could have done something about that, or he could have pushed for that while he was president, and instead he waits until he's leaving. All right, so if you're thinking about criticisms of the military-industrial complex or the arms race, one of the things that we can do is we can look at the Butter Battle book, which is actually a Dr. Seuss book. And so I've linked the animated version of this book. It's a parody of the Cold War and the arms race. And it's actually printed in the 1980s, but it kind of shows those things. At that moment, Dr. Seuss is actually upset about the rhetoric or the actions of Ronald Reagan, who's the president in the 80s. But it's very helpful for right now, too, under the Eisenhower era. And Dr. Seuss says of his book or his kind of beliefs, I'm not anti-military, just anti-crazy. And he really thinks that this kind of growing arms race and the rhetoric of the United States is harmful or dangerous at this moment. So it's a really good book. It's kind of fun. So you might take some time to look at it. I'll kind of go over a couple things in the next video about it. But just a little bit of a heads up, it's essentially these two groups, the Ukes and the Zooks, and they disagree with each other about how you butter toast. And this is Dr. Seuss's way of just kind of pointing out how ridiculous the arms race and the Cold War is. All right, moving along. So one of the things that we see in the Cold War is the CIA doing some funny things around the world. And one of the places that they do that is in Guatemala. So I'm going to show you. This is the very sanitized or cleaned up version about what the CIA does in Guatemala. So your textbook, or lots of textbooks, says the CIA was increasingly active in the 1950s. In addition to collecting information, CIA agents also took part in secret actions against hostile governments. For example, during Eisenhower's first term, CIA agents helped overthrow governments in Guatemala and Iran. So in a very short amount of time, we talk about the CIA taking action against hostile governments. So I want to know why they're hostile. Are they actually hostile? And then we help overthrow two nations' governments. And that's it. That's all we write. So I want you to think about what would happen if somebody tried to overthrow the United States government or somebody actually overthrew the United States government. Would we breeze by that in a couple sentences, or would we care more about the details? All right, so I'm going to show you one of the declassified documents about Guatemala so we can think about maybe what actually happened. And I've just typed up what the document says because it's a little bit hard to read. But essentially it says that this is an assassination list compiled by the CIA and Carlos Castillo Armas, who is a military general who will ultimately overthrow Arbenz Guzman. And it says the names of the agency's intended victims were divided into two categories: persons to be disposed of through executive action, killed, or those to be imprisoned or exiled, sent away. Okay, and that says during the operation. All right, I'm going to go ahead and show you this list. Here's your list. That's it. There you go. So even when this list is declassified, they get rid of all of the names. And so I challenge you to think about why the government still leaves off those names. Even though we're talking about 50 years later, they still felt that it was too dangerous, or claimed that it was too dangerous to release the people that they either helped execute or assassinate or send to prison or in exile. And what we see is these two guys are going to help come up with this policy that will lead to America helping to overthrow governments. All right, so here are the Dulles brothers again. So we have John Foster Dulles, who I already mentioned was the Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles, who is the head of the CIA. So they're brothers. During World War II, they had been lawyers that are profiting off of American companies in Germany. Yes, the American companies are going to support the Nazis. Don't do too much digging into some companies you like, because if they've been around a while, probably got some skeletons in their closet. But anyways, these two men are going to be actively involved in Eisenhower's foreign policy. And Allen Dulles is originally going to work for the OSS, which is American intelligence that will ultimately become the CIA. So that's at the end of Truman's time in office, but Truman will use the CIA differently. He says, no, absolutely, we're not using plots to overthrow foreign leaders. We're not doing that. We're just gathering information. Eisenhower says, all right, do it. And so Truman, we're going to collect information. Eisenhower, A-OK to overthrow democratically elected leaders. All right, so that's going to give the Dulles brothers green light, essentially, to do some things. So what the Dulles brothers do is they come up with a list of 6 monsters. These are guys that they're going to claim are communists or bad for America. And so it's these guys: Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, Sukarno in Indonesia, Patrice Lumumba in Congo, and Fidel Castro in Cuba. However, of this list of 6, only 2 of them are actually communist. The rest of them are nationalist leaders who want independence and control over natural resources. So they want a country that benefits its citizens and to have control over their natural resources. But for the Dulles brothers and for many in America or the American government, that's not good. They want access to those resources. They want control. They want those countries in their sphere of influence doing what they think is best, or what will at least benefit the United States. So these brothers are going to try and take out these leaders or change the leadership in these countries. The craziest thing is that the only 2 that the Dulles brothers don't take out or that the CIA doesn't get rid of are the 2 that are actually communists. Fidel Castro and Ho Chi Minh will rule their countries until their death. Castro dies in the 2000s, and we're talking about the 1950s. So not very good about taking out maybe the actual enemies, the actual communists, and instead taking out these other people. And when I say taking out, some of them die. So that is on America. So what these brothers believe, up here, is that any threat to corporate interests was support for communism. So if you don't support an American business in these countries, then you support communism. So that us versus them, or that other that we've mentioned earlier. And he even says, meaning John Foster Dulles, that there are 2 kinds of people in the world. There are those who are Christian and support free enterprise, and there are others. So you have to be Christian and you have to support free enterprise or pure capitalism, and then there are others. And by that he means enemies or he means communists. There's no gray area or in between for these Dulles brothers. Move myself over here. And so some people say, you know what, we should judge these men in the context of the Cold War, essentially give them the benefit of the doubt. Except our actions or unwillingness to work with, in lots of these cases, democratically elected leaders means that they're going to turn to the Soviet Union for help. When we turn our back on them, they're going to look for help elsewhere. And they've been willing to work with us until we get involved. And to just give you the idea or the level of terribleness or violence that the CIA is perpetuating around the world, LBJ, or Lyndon Baines Johnson, when he is president, says of the CIA that they are a goddamn murder inc. in the Caribbean at the benefit of American enterprise. So we see these brothers put profit for American companies over people's lives, and people die. If we look at this list over here, Mbamba, Arbenz, and Mossadegh for sure die, essentially as a result of these coups, and that's on the United States. That is part of our legacy. So the reason I'm going to hopefully end this one very quickly is I would like to give you some time to kind of do some digging on some of these countries. So in the 50s, we're going to see the CIA get involved in Guatemala, Iran, the 60s, Indonesia, and the 70s, Chile. So Iran, there's a really interesting podcast you could listen to. In Indonesia, there is an article, and the documents, they're not really documents, they're articles for these other places, as well as kind of an overview of the CIA, are hyperlinked right here, and I'll post online. There's no questions or anything. I'm just going to challenge you to kind of do some digging into one of these countries. I think it will help really cement what it is that the CIA is doing at that time. And just a little bit of background on that. 2 words you're going to want to know. Number 1, coup. This is not a coup. There's no chickens involved. It's a coup. And this is a sudden, violent, and illegal seizure of power from a government. So this is that overthrow of a government. And the other thing you'll hear a lot is to nationalize. So one of the things that many of these leaders are doing is they're taking a major branch of industry or commerce from private to state ownership. And this is not like the government is taking over everything that you would see in pure communism, but this is the idea of in Guatemala, it's land, and the land is owned by an American company who is exploiting the land and the people. And the government of Guatemala sees that as a national good. And so they seize part of it that's not being used in order to help people of Guatemala. In Iran, it has to do with oil. In Chile, it has to do with the telephone company and something else. So it's these natural goods or these natural products, or native products, maybe I should say, that they want to take back over to benefit their people. It's not full ownership of the government, but it's that it's better in the hands of the country or the citizens of these countries rather than a foreign enterprise or a foreign company. But ultimately, what we see is that those coups that the United States is going to help with, and when I say that, things that they're doing is they are paying journalists, they're paying protesters, they're helping people get murdered, they're spreading misinformation, they are crippling countries' economies. Rather than create stability or create countries that are loyal to the United States or think highly of the United States, we don't see that. What we see is that we don't get pro-American stability. We see a move away from democracy and towards repression, often lots of violence. In places like Chile, hundreds of thousands of people go missing, dead, as a result of the dictator or the authoritarian that gets put in power. The other thing is we see that Guatemala and Iran are going to kind of set the precedent or the standard for how the CIA acts. I mentioned that the domestic version of the CIA is the FBI, but both of them are not following American laws, and there's no oversight to their actions. So it's the Wild Wild West. And that costs lots of people their lives and erodes democracy in lots of places that it existed. In almost all of these places, the communist threat is exaggerated. Communism isn't going to flourish in any of these countries. It's that there is an American company or American economic interest that is threatened, and that is why the CIA will often step in. We talk a lot about democracy or promoting democracy, but once the US government gets whoever they want, whatever puppet they want in place, or whoever they think is going to listen to the United States, they stop talking about democracy. It's no longer an important talking piece to us. And what we see is today, lots of these countries are going to guard against coups. They can do that for a couple reasons. One, they've gotten smarter. The other thing is the United States would just invade. Prior to this, the reason that it's a lot of covert actions is we were worried about the Soviet Union getting involved. So if we invaded a Soviet ally or somebody under the Soviet sphere, the Soviet Union would step in. And so we did more covert things. Now we don't have those two superpower dynamics. And so we can just invade, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or other places. All right. I'm actually going to come back to this because this is one of your journal entries or your journal questions. And so we'll kind of go back to this later. I might actually bring this up when we do our little Zoom meetings. You could also think about it with this. So as you read that article, or if you've already read that article, think about how this is symbolic of the Cold War legacy. If we are this nation that is talking about freedom and democracy and spreading those things around the world, do we live up to that? Do we provide freedom and democracy and resources and support to increase those things around the world? Or those empty promises? All right. And I think I'm going to end on that super happy, uplifting moment. And I will see you all